At 72, Margaret radiates a quiet strength, her laughter rich with wisdom. She wasn't always this free. For years, she carried wounds that time never truly erased. Regrets, lost friendships, words left unsaid. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live beyond the pain. No one tells you that emotional wounds resurface when life slows down. But here's the truth. It's never too late to heal. Today, we uncover 15 powerful insights that helped women like Margaret reclaim peace, starting with the first, understanding why old wounds still linger. 1. Old wounds don't disappear with age, they often resurface. When life slows down, Margaret had always believed that time heals all wounds. But as she entered her 70s, she realized that time doesn't erase pain. It only buries it. With fewer daily distractions, memories once tucked away resurfaced with startling clarity. The arguments left unresolved, the friendships that faded, the childhood moments that shaped her but were never spoken about, all returned, uninvited, in quiet moments. She found herself thinking about the people she had lost touch with, replaying old regrets, and wondering why certain emotions still held such weight. She had spent years pushing forward, believing that if she ignored the past, it would lose its power. But emotional wounds don't simply vanish with age. They wait. At first, she tried to dismiss them. What's the point of looking back now, she thought. But the more she ignored these feelings, the more they lingered. It wasn't until she acknowledged them that she understood a difficult truth. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about facing what still lingers and giving it the attention it was always denied. The past doesn't disappear. It waits for the right moment to be understood. 2. Childhood pain and past relationships still influence emotional well-being. Margaret had assumed that childhood struggles were left behind in childhood. But as she reflected, she saw how early experiences still shaped the way she responded to life. The way she struggled to ask for help. The way she avoided conflict. The deep-rooted belief that she had to earn love, all traced back to moments she barely remembered yet carried every day. She had learned to be strong, to handle things on her own, and to suppress feelings that seemed too big. But she never considered how much energy it took to hold everything in, how that silent burden had shaped her relationships, her self-worth, and even her happiness. It wasn't just childhood experiences that shaped her. Past relationships had left their marks too. The betrayals, the unspoken words, the love that was lost, all of it formed invisible patterns in the way she connected with people. She noticed how she held back in friendships, how she feared being vulnerable, how she avoided certain conversations because they felt too raw. Recognizing these patterns didn't mean blaming the past, but it did mean understanding how much of it still lived in the present. Some wounds had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. 3. Unspoken grief can manifest as loneliness, anxiety, or self-doubt. Margaret had lost people she loved, some suddenly, others after long goodbyes. She believed she had grieved properly, moving forward as best she could, but grief doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it hides in unexpected places, in the moments of loneliness, in the anxious thoughts, in the quiet self-doubt that whispers, "Who am I now that they are gone?" She noticed how certain anniversaries left her feeling restless, how certain songs triggered emotions she thought she had processed. She had spent years telling herself to be strong, to keep going, to not dwell on loss. But pushing emotions aside hadn't made them disappear. It had only made them harder to recognize. She started to see how unspoken grief had shaped her in ways she hadn't realized. She found herself hesitating to get close to new people, fearing loss before it even happened. She avoided bringing up certain names in conversation, not wanting to stir emotions she wasn't sure how to handle. The grief she thought she had left behind was still there, woven into the fabric of her everyday life. It wasn't about sadness. It was about unresolved love, unspoken words, and the parts of herself that she had unconsciously held back. Some wounds weren't about forgetting, but about finding a way to carry them differently. 4. Acceptance is not about approval. It's about freeing yourself from the past. Margaret had spent years holding on to the past, not because she wanted to, but because she wasn't sure how to let it go. Some moments still carried a sting, words she wished she had said, choices she regretted, situations that never had closure. She often wondered, what if things had been different? For a long time, she resisted the idea of acceptance. It felt like giving up, as if she were excusing the pain or pretending it hadn't mattered. But she came to realize that acceptance wasn't about approval. It was about freeing herself from carrying the same emotional weight over and over again. She started by acknowledging what she couldn't change. No amount of replaying the past would rewrite history. She allowed herself to feel the sadness, the frustration, the grief. But instead of staying stuck in it, she imagined what it would feel like to release it. Slowly, she began loosening her grip, not by forcing herself to forget, but by shifting how she held on to those memories. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer had to control her. 5. Letting go of resentment opens space for inner peace. Margaret had always told herself she wasn't someone who held grudges, but certain names, certain memories, still made her chest tighten. She could feel resentment buried deep inside, even if she rarely spoke of it. She hadn't realized how much energy it took to carry those emotions, how every reminder of past betrayals stirred something within her. At times, she felt justified in her anger. After all, some wounds had been unfair, undeserved. But as she reflected, she questioned, who was this anger really hurting? She saw how resentment had built walls around her heart, making her hesitant to trust, to open up, to fully embrace new relationships. The people who had hurt her were no longer in her life, yet she was still giving them space in her thoughts. Letting go of resentment wasn't about saying what happened was okay. It was about reclaiming her peace. She chose to stop letting past pain dictate her present happiness. The moment she did, she felt lighter, because forgiveness wasn't about them, it was about freeing herself. 6. The power of rewriting. Your own narrative, seeing your life with a fresh perspective. Margaret had spent so long looking at her life through the lens of what went wrong. She saw the missed chances, the heartbreaks, the struggles that had shaped her. But one day, she asked herself a different question. What if I told my story differently? She started by writing down some of her most painful experiences, not as tragedies, but as moments of transformation. Instead of focusing on loss, she looked at the strength she had gained. Instead of seeing herself as someone who had been hurt, she saw herself as someone who had survived, adapted, and kept going. She realized that her story wasn't just about pain. It was about resilience. She wasn't just someone who had been let down. She was someone who had learned to stand on her own. She wasn't just someone who had faced loss. She was someone who had loved deeply. Rewriting her narrative didn't change the past, but it changed how she carried it. Her life wasn't a collection of wounds. It was a testament to her strength. 7. You are more than your past. How to separate pain from identity. Margaret had spent years defining herself by the struggles she endured. When she thought about who she was, the first things that came to mind were the losses, the heartbreaks, and the moments of deep disappointment. Her identity felt intertwined with pain, as if everything she had been through had shaped her into someone who was always meant to carry sadness. She hadn't realized that emotional wounds, when left unhealed, could blur the line between what happened and who she was. The past was part of her story, but it didn't have to be the whole story. She started asking herself, who am I beyond what I've lost? She thought about the things that brought her joy, the ways she had shown strength, and the moments where she had been more than her pain. Slowly, she began redefining herself, not as someone broken, but as someone whole. She stopped introducing herself to the world through the lens of her wounds and instead started embracing the fullness of who she was. She was not just her past. She was her resilience, her laughter, her ability to love despite everything. 8. Self-compassion is a skill, not a luxury. Learning to be kind to yourself. Margaret had always been kind to others. She knew how to comfort a friend, offer reassurance, and remind someone else of their worth. But when it came to herself, her words were much harsher. She replayed mistakes over and over, criticized herself for things she would never judge others for, and believed that she should have handled things better in the past. She never realized how exhausting it was to be at war with herself. Self-compassion had always seemed like a luxury, something soft and unnecessary. But as she paid attention to her thoughts, she saw how often she treated herself like an enemy instead of an ally. She began practicing small acts of self-kindness. When negative thoughts surfaced, she paused and asked, "Would I say this to a friend?" If the answer was no, she replaced it with a gentler, more forgiving thought. The more she embraced self-compassion, the more her inner world softened. She stopped punishing herself for the past and started offering herself the same grace she had always given to others. 9. Setting emotional boundaries is an act of self-care, not selfishness. Margaret had spent much of her life putting others first. She was always the person who showed up, who listened, who gave without asking for anything in return. She prided herself on being reliable, but over time, she realized that saying yes to everyone else often meant saying no to herself. She had never been comfortable setting boundaries. The idea of disappointing someone, of not being available, made her anxious. She equated love with sacrifice, believing that caring for others meant putting her own needs aside. But as she reflected, she saw how resentment had crept in, how she felt drained, unappreciated, and even taken for granted at times. She began practicing boundaries in small ways. Instead of automatically saying yes, she paused and asked herself, "Do I really want to do this?" If the answer was no, she allowed herself to decline, without guilt, without over-explaining. As she set these emotional boundaries, something surprising happened. The people who truly valued her understood. They didn't walk away. Instead, they respected her choices, and her relationships became healthier, built on mutual respect rather than silent obligation. 10. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the gateway to deeper relationships. Margaret had always been guarded. She had learned that keeping emotions private was safer, that exposing too much of herself meant risking judgment, rejection, or even disappointment. She had spent years being the strong one, the dependable one, the one who held things together. But deep down, she longed for deeper connections, friendships that weren't just surface level, relationships where she felt truly seen. She realized that meaningful relationships required vulnerability. For years, she had avoided expressing her true feelings, brushing off concerns with phrases like, "I'm fine," or "it's nothing." But as she started to open up, first in small ways, then in bigger conversations, she saw a shift. When she admitted she was struggling, friends responded with warmth and understanding. When she shared her fears, she found that others had similar worries. Being vulnerable didn't mean being weak. It meant allowing herself to be fully human, to be known, understood, and embraced for exactly who she was. 11. Forgiving yourself is just as important as forgiving others. Margaret had spent years carrying the weight of self-blame. She had forgiven others for their mistakes, yet she struggled to extend that same grace to herself. She replayed moments where she wished she had been stronger, kinder, or made different choices. She carried guilt over things she couldn't change, relationships that ended, words left unsaid, roads not taken. She hadn't realized how much this self-judgment was holding her back until she asked herself, would I treat a friend this way? She knew the answer. She would never expect someone else to be perfect, yet she held herself to an impossible standard. She began practicing self-forgiveness, recognizing that every choice she made was based on the knowledge she had at the time. She couldn't change the past, but she could decide how she carried it forward. As she let go of self-blame, she felt a deep sense of relief. Forgiving herself didn't mean forgetting. It meant acknowledging that she was worthy of the same compassion she had always given others. 12. Building new relationships in later life can be healing and fulfilling. Margaret had once believed that making new friends after 70 was nearly impossible. She had assumed that deep connections were something built in youth, and that the older she got, the harder it would be to form meaningful relationships. But as she embraced her journey of healing, she realized that connection wasn't limited by age. It was limited by fear. She started seeking out new opportunities to meet people. She joined a local discussion group, attended workshops that interested her, and made an effort to strike up conversations. At first, it felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But over time, she discovered that so many other women were looking for the same thing: companionship, understanding, shared experiences. She learned that relationships could be built at any stage of life. The depth of connection wasn't about how long you had known someone. It was about the willingness to show up, to listen, and to be present. The friendships she formed in her later years became some of the most fulfilling relationships of her life. Building new connections wasn't about replacing the past. It was about embracing the future with an open heart. 13. Gratitude transforms wounds into wisdom. Margaret had spent years focusing on what was lost, the relationships that had faded, the opportunities she wished she had taken, and the moments she could never get back. But as she progressed in her journey, she realized that her focus had been shaping her emotions. The more she dwelled on what she no longer had, the more she felt weighed down. She began a simple practice. Each night before bed, she wrote down 3 things she was grateful for. At first, the list was obvious: good health, a roof over her head, a warm meal. But as days passed, she noticed gratitude in smaller moments: the way sunlight poured through the window in the morning, the kindness of a stranger, the laughter shared over a phone call. Over time, gratitude shifted her perspective. She wasn't ignoring the difficult parts of life, but she was choosing to focus on what still remained, rather than what was gone. The wounds of the past became lessons, and every day, she found new reasons to appreciate the life she had. Gratitude didn't erase the past, but it gave her the strength to move forward with peace. 14. Pursuing new experiences brings emotional renewal. Margaret had always thought healing was about looking inward, reflecting, processing, making peace with the past. But she discovered that healing also required movement, stepping into new experiences that reminded her that life was still unfolding. She started saying yes to things she had once dismissed. She joined a painting class, even though she had never held a brush. She traveled to a town she had always wanted to visit, even though the idea of going alone once scared her. She attended social gatherings, not because she needed to make friends, but because she wanted to see what life had to offer. Each new experience reminded her that healing wasn't just about making peace with what was. It was about embracing what could be. Trying new things gave her a sense of renewal, an understanding that she wasn't limited by age or past struggles. She felt a spark of excitement again, a reminder that life had more to offer than she had once believed. Pursuing new experiences wasn't about filling time, it was about rediscovering herself in ways she never expected. 15. Your life story is still being written. Embracing the future with hope. Margaret once believed that her story had already been written. The major moments of her life had passed, and she thought the future would simply be a continuation of what had come before. But as she reflected on her transformation, she realized that wasn't true. Every single day was a blank page, an opportunity to create something new. She no longer saw herself as someone at the end of a journey. Instead, she was at the beginning of a new chapter, one where she was no longer weighed down by emotional wounds, no longer living in regret or self-doubt. She made a decision to approach each day with openness, to see possibilities instead of limitations. She stopped assuming that joy belonged to the past and started believing that it could exist in the present. The future wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace, with curiosity, with courage, and with the understanding that healing wasn't the end of her journey. It was the start of something beautiful. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about reclaiming your future. Margaret's journey proves that emotional wounds don't define you. How you move forward does. Now, it's your turn. Embrace gratitude, welcome new experiences, and step into each day with hope. Your story isn't over. It's still being written.